The wailing wind carried Martha Ellery's desperate whisper across the dusty yard of her lonely Arizona ranch. "I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother," she said again, her voice breaking as she faced the tall Apache man standing in the shadow of her barn. The last light of evening stretched long across the prairie, touching her face with the color of dying fire. Her eyes were swollen from tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 2 months had passed since her husband rode away and told the people of Cold Harrow that she was barren as the winter hills. He left her reputation behind in the dust of his horse's trail. Every whisper in town carried her name like poison. And now, in her desperation, she stood before a man who should have been her enemy. Ahiv had come only to trade pelts that day, not to hear a white woman offer such a bargain. He watched her quietly, his dark eyes unreadable. Behind him, 50 head of prime cattle grazed in the fading light, wealth enough to make any man rich for life. But her offer was something else entirely. It crossed every boundary between their worlds. "They will hate you more than they already do," Ahiv said at last, his deep voice calm but firm. His English was careful, each word weighed like a stone before it fell. Martha lifted her chin, tears drying on her cheeks. "They already hate me," she whispered. "What more can they take?" The lantern hanging in her window flickered, throwing soft light across the yard. Across the valley, she could see the glow of Orrin Talbert's ranch house, her neighbor, her rival, and the man already circling her land like a vulture. She knew the talk in town. A woman alone couldn't run a ranch, couldn't protect herself, couldn't survive without a man. 1 year, she said, meeting Ahiv's gaze directly. "Stay 1 year. Give me a child, and everything I own, every head of cattle, this house, this land, becomes yours." Ahiv's silence stretched like the desert horizon. He had lost his family years ago in a raid that scattered his tribe to the wind. Since then, he had lived between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. He looked at Martha and saw a different kind of emptiness, but one he recognized. "There's food inside," Martha said finally. "Eat while you consider." Her voice steadied, carrying the tone of a woman used to doing things alone. She turned and walked toward the cabin, her back straight, despite the weight she carried in her heart. The small cabin was neat, but lonely. 1 plate on the table, 1 cup beside the coffee pot. 1 chair pulled up by the fire. It looked as though no man had ever lived there. The marks of her husband, Thomas Ellery, had been wiped away long ago. Ahiv ate quietly, his movements slow and deliberate. He watched her as she busied herself by the stove, her shoulders stiff with pride or fear. He could not tell which. "Your husband," he said finally. "He left because there was no child?" Martha didn't turn. Her hands gripped the counter. 6 years of marriage," she said flatly. 6 years of failure. The doctor said there was nothing wrong with either of us. But Thomas, he needed someone to blame. Her voice broke as she turned toward him. "He started visiting the saloon girls in Tucson. Said he needed to prove it wasn't his fault." Ahiv listened without speaking. He had learned long ago that some pain needed no reply. 2 weeks after calling me barren in front of half the town, she continued, he sold his half of the cattle to Orrin Talbert and rode out with one of those girls. I haven't seen him since. Outside, a coyote cried across the hills, its lonely voice echoing through the empty land. Ahiv set down his spoon. "My people believe children come when the ancestors decide," he said quietly, "not when men demand it." Martha gave a small, bitter laugh. "I don't care about ancestors or God," she said. "I care about legacy, about not disappearing like dust in the wind. When I die, no one will remember I ever existed. This land, these cattle, that's all I have to leave behind." Ahiv studied her face in the flickering firelight. Beneath the hardness, he saw courage. She reminded him of the women of his tribe, those who had buried husbands, raised children, and kept going no matter the cost. "If I stay," he said slowly, The town will turn against you even more. They will come with guns and fire." Martha looked him dead in the eye. "Let them come. They already took everything from me but my name. At least this way I choose my fate." Ahiv nodded slightly, the fire reflecting in his eyes like twin coals. He rose, towering above her in the small cabin. "I will give you my answer in 3 days." When he left, the night swallowed him whole. Martha stood in the doorway, watching his shadow fade into the dark hills. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Ahiv rode back toward the foothills, where his camp lay hidden among the juniper trees. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the scent of smoke and distant rain. He thought of her words, her trembling voice, the stubborn fire in her eyes. In his small cave he built a fire and sat before it, letting the sacred smoke rise toward the stars. He asked his ancestors for guidance, but only silence answered. Perhaps they too had turned away. By the second day, he saw her offered differently, not as a trade of flesh, but as a pact between two lost souls. The cattle could rebuild his life, yes, but the woman, her courage, her pain, stirred something deeper. On the third morning, when the sun broke red over the ridge, Ahiv packed his few belongings. The decision was made. When Martha saw him riding back across the eastern pasture, her breath caught. The cold wind tugged at her shawl, but she didn't move until he stopped in front of her. "I have considered your offer," he said simply. "I will stay for 1 year, but there must be conditions." Her heart thudded in her chest. "What conditions?" "I will not be your servant," Ahiv said. "If I stay, I work as a partner. I help run the ranch. We decide together." Martha nodded slowly, the corner of her mouth lifting. "Agreed, but the deed stays in my name until a child is born. If there's no child after a year, you still get the cattle." Ahiv looked toward the town, then back at her. "They will not forgive this. You will be alone." Martha's eyes shone with fierce resolve. "I already am." And with that, their dangerous partnership began, the bargain that would ignite a storm across Cold Harrow. Word spread through Cold Harrow faster than wildfire on a dry prairie. By the time the Sunday church bell rang, every man and woman in town knew that Martha Ellery had taken an Apache man into her home. Some said she'd gone mad from loneliness. Others whispered darker things, that she'd sold her soul for a child. When Martha entered the church that morning, heads turned and whispers filled the air. The preacher's voice trembled as he delivered a sermon about sin and temptation, his eyes never leaving her face. Women clutched their children tighter. Men avoided her gaze. But Martha kept her head high, walking straight down the aisle, as if she didn't hear a word. Only one person spoke to her afterward. Old Mrs. Gunderson, half-blind and nearly deaf. The old woman took Martha's hand with surprising strength and said, "Don't you let them scare you, girl. You've done what they all wish they had the courage to do. Choose your own path." Quote, "By Monday, Sheriff Vern Lockridge rode out to the Ellery Ranch. His hat was in his hand, and his face carried the weary look of a man caught between duty and conscience. He found Martha and Ahiv working side by side, mending a corral fence. Mrs. Ellery," the sheriff began, clearing his throat, "the town's concerned about your situation." His eyes flicked toward Ahiv, who stood tall and calm, the wind stirring his dark hair. "People are saying," Martha cut him off. "People always say, Sheriff, you came here to enforce a law, or just to gossip like the rest." Lockridge shifted uncomfortably. "No law has been broken, ma'am, but it's not proper." "Proper?" Martha's hammer struck the fence post hard, sending a sharp echo through the air. "Proper is a man abandoning his wife? Proper is the town trying to take my land because I'm a woman alone?" Ahiv stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Or is it improper because I am Apache?" The sheriff swallowed hard. "It's not like that." "It is exactly like that," Ahiv said. "But your laws are not my concern, only hers." Lockridge turned his horse, tugging at the reins. "Just be careful," he muttered. "People are riled up." By the end of that week, Martha could feel the weight of Cold Harrow pressing closer. The general store refused to sell her supplies. The blacksmith doubled his prices. Her mail stopped arriving. It was clear that someone, likely Orrin Talbert, had spread word that helping her would bring trouble. "They mean to starve us out," Martha said one evening as she set 2 plates on the table. Ahiv nodded, his face unreadable. "Then we trade elsewhere," he said. "Navajo to the north, Mexicans to the south. There are always people who deal fair." He kept his word. Within days, wagons began arriving from distant settlements. Men who spoke little English but nodded respectfully to Ahiv. They traded tools, seed, and grain for cattle hides. Slowly, the ranch began to breathe again. But not everyone approved. Late one night, the cattle in the east pasture stampeded without warning. Martha and Ahiv rushed outside to find 3 of their best cows dead, their throats cut clean. The message was clear. This was no accident. "They want us afraid," Ahiv said quietly, kneeling beside one of the fallen animals. His fingers brushed the wound. "White knives." "Professional." Martha felt her stomach twist, but her voice stayed firm. "Then they'll learn fear cuts both ways." The next morning, they found black oil floating on the creek water. Someone had poisoned the stream. Ahiv rode upstream until he found the barrels dumped near the property line. He built a makeshift dam and diverted the clean flow through a new channel. Martha watched him work, her hand resting on her stomach. The last few weeks she had felt changes, small at first, but growing stronger. She told no one, not even him. Not until she was certain. One frosty morning, while Ahiv was chopping firewood, she stood in the doorway, trembling. "Ahiv," she called softly. He turned, breath clouding in the cold air. "It's happened," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. "I'm with child." Quote, For a moment he said nothing. Then he set down the axe and stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "My grandmother used to say," he murmured, "that a spirit chooses its parents long before it is born. Maybe this child has chosen us both." Martha pressed a shaking hand to her belly. "Then it's chosen a hard road." In the following weeks, danger drew closer. Sheriff Lockridge returned, this time with real fear in his eyes. "Talbert's brought in men from down south," he warned. "Not ranch hands, killers. He's planning something." Ahiv already knew. He had been scouting the hills at night, watching torchlights flicker near Talbert's property. 15 men, he said. "They train with rifles at dawn. They'll come soon." Martha nodded grimly. "Then we prepare." They turned the ranch into a fortress. Ahiv rigged signal bells along the fence lines, hidden snares, and watch points across the ridges. Old Gus Hansen, the blacksmith, arrived with his wagon of tools after his shop in town mysteriously burned down. "Figured I'd rather stand with folks worth something," he said simply. By December, the first snow covered the hills. Martha's belly had begun to show, the child growing strong despite the fear that surrounded them. At night, Ahiv would sit beside the fire, his deep voice low as he sang old Apache songs, prayers for protection, for strength, for new beginnings. One night he said softly, "My people tell stories of children born between worlds. They carry the strength of both. Maybe your child will be such a one." Martha smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then he'll have to be strong, because this world won't make it easy." The first attack came before dawn on a moonless night. Bells rang out from the north pasture. The warning system Ahiv had set. 3 riders charged the herd, trying to drive them through a cut fence. Gunfire cracked through the darkness. Ahiv and Gus were already outside, rifles in hand. Martha, heavy with child, watched from the window, heart hammering. The raiders fled after a short, sharp exchange. One was hit and left behind. They found him wounded but alive, one of Talbert's hired men. "Tell your boss," Ahiv said coldly, standing over him. "The next time, there will be no mercy." Winter wrapped the land in silence after that, but everyone knew it was only the calm before the storm. The final reckoning was coming. Martha stood on the porch one evening, hand on her belly, watching Ahiv repair the fence under the pale moon. "When this child comes," she said softly, "I don't care what the world says. He'll know where he came from love, not from fear." Ahiv looked up, meeting her eyes. "Then we'll make sure he has a world worth being born into." But far across the valley, Orrin Talbert was gathering his men. And the next time they came, it would not be with knives in the dark. It would be war. The dawn broke blood red over Cold Harrow, the color of warning. Martha stood at the window, one hand on her swollen belly, watching dark clouds roll in from the west. The wind had that heavy stillness before a storm, not just of weather, but of men. Ahiv was already outside, checking rifles and reinforcing the barn doors. He moved with the calm of a man who'd seen battle before, every motion precise, every sound measured. "They'll come today," he said quietly when he stepped back inside. "The wind hides their approach. It's how I would do it." Martha nodded, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Then let them come." By mid-morning, the first rider appeared. Sheriff Lockridge, his horse lathered with sweat, a white cloth tied to his saddle horn. He looked weary, ashamed. "Talbert sent me," he said, removing his hat. "He's giving you one last chance to sell. Half what the land's worth. He says if you refuse, he can't control what happens next." Martha's jaw tightened. "Tell Mr. Talbert my answer is the same as before. Anyone crossing that fence is a trespasser, and trespassers will be treated as such." Lockridge hesitated, his gaze flicking toward her rounded stomach. "You're in no shape for a fight, Martha. Think of the child." "I am," she said softly. "That's exactly why I won't give in." Quote. The sheriff nodded grimly, knowing words wouldn't move her. He turned his horse and rode off, a lonely figure swallowed by the rising dust. By noon, the horizon shimmered with riders. 15, maybe more. Men Talbert had hired from El Paso and beyond. Hard faces, cold eyes. They spread out in a wide line as they advanced toward the Ellery ranch. Inside the cabin, Martha loaded the last box of cartridges. Old Gus Hansen sat by the window, his rifle steady across the sill. Two Navajo traders who had become their friends took positions by the barn, their eyes sharp and watchful. Ahiv moved like a shadow, silent and sure. He placed his hand briefly on Martha's shoulder. "Whatever happens," he said, "stay low, protect our child." She met his gaze. "You protect our home." The first shot cracked through the still air, followed by another and another, until the valley roared with gunfire. Bullets tore through the dry grass, splintered fence posts, and sent birds screaming into the sky. Ahiv returned fire from behind a stone wall, each shot deliberate. Gus's rifle thundered from the loft, dropping 2 riders before they reached the barn. The Navajo marksmen answered from the ridge, their bullets precise and silent. The attackers pressed harder, but the defenders held their ground. Smoke filled the air, mixing with dust and fear. Martha fired through the cabin window, her hands shaking but her aim true. She hit a man's arm as he tried to light a torch. He fell back, screaming, the fire spilling harmlessly onto the dirt. After an hour, the shooting slowed. The raiders were pinned, confused, and losing nerve. Then, from the hills beyond, came a haunting sound. War cries rising like the wind. Ahiv froze, recognizing it instantly. Out of the storm clouds emerged a band of Apache warriors, faces painted, rifles gleaming. They rode like spirits through the smoke, answering Ahiv's long-sent call for aid. The fight turned in moments. Talbert's men, unprepared for such fury, broke formation. Horses scattered, the air filled with shouts, gunfire, and the pounding of hooves. Within minutes, the attackers fled, leaving their wounded behind. From a distant ridge, Orrin Talbert watched everything through his field glasses. His smug smile faded as his plan unraveled. He turned to leave, but Sheriff Lockridge was waiting behind him, revolver drawn. "It's over, Orrin," the sheriff said. "I've got witnesses, confessions, and the law on my side for once. You'll answer for this." Talbert's empire collapsed that same day. Back at the ranch, the battle smoke drifted away, leaving silence. Ahiv found Martha sitting on the porch steps, her face pale but calm, a rifle resting beside her. When he knelt beside her, she took his hand and pressed it to her belly. "He's still," she whispered, "but I think he's strong." Ahiv looked into her eyes, and for the first time in years he smiled. The weeks that followed brought peace, a fragile kind but real. Talbert was locked away, his lands sold to pay debts. The people of Cold Harrow began to see the Ellery Ranch not as a scandal but as a story of survival. By early spring, Martha's time came. The night was long and cold, the wind howling outside as Ahiv tended the fire. The Navajo midwife, summoned days before, arrived just as the full moon climbed high over the valley. Martha labored through the night, gripping Ahiv's hand, her cries mixing with the wind. Near midnight, a final scream filled the cabin, and then the soft, shuddering cry of a newborn. Ahiv lifted the child gently, awe softening his strong features. A boy. Dark skin, blue eyes, a perfect mix of both worlds. Martha lay back, tears shining on her cheeks. "James Ioka Ellery," she whispered hoarsely. "James for my grandfather. Ioka for your people." Ahiv touched the baby's tiny hand. Ioka means, he brings happiness. Quote. The next morning, the word spread through the valley. Cold Harrow, once full of whispers and judgment, sent gifts instead of gossip. Blankets, food, and small toys arrived at their door. Even Deacon Hurst came, Bible in hand, asking permission to bless the child. After the preacher left, Ahiv performed his own blessing, sprinkling sacred pollen in the four directions. His deep voice humming an old Apache song that seemed to make the wind pause to listen. As spring ripened into summer, the ranch flourished. The cattle grew strong, the grass green under careful rotation. The methods Ahiv taught, moving herds, preserving water, spread to other ranches. Martha started a small school on the property, where white and Apache children learned side by side. Their love, once born of desperation, had become something sacred, a bridge between two worlds. Years later, travelers passing through Cold Harrow would hear the story of the white woman who defied her town and the Apache who defended her. Some called it scandal, others legend. But for those who knew the truth, it was a story of courage, redemption, and the family that grew from a single, desperate whisper. At sunset, Martha often stood outside the cabin, watching Ahiv teach their growing son to ride. The sky blazed gold and red above the hills. She smiled softly, remembering that night long ago when she'd made a bargain with the wind itself. "I'll give you all my cattle," she had whispered. "Just make me a mother." And in the end, the wind had kept its promise.